June 1941. The leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, is in his office reading a report about the latest developments of the Second World War. Suddenly, the tranquility is interrupted when the phone rings. On the other end of the line, a trembling voice officer informs him of bad news. Adolf Hitler has decided to break the non-aggression pact he had signed 2 years earlier with the communist nation and invade it. An army of colossal proportions is heading there, with the aim of razing everything and seizing its natural resources. At first, the Soviet leader can't believe what he's hearing. He trusted the word of the Führer and didn't see such a large-scale offensive as possible. He thinks it's bravado, or a maneuver planned by rebellious German generals. Under no circumstances would the Nazi dictator dare to take such a risk. Just in case, Stalin orders not to react until it's confirmed that the German government has given the green light to the invasion. 4 hours later, the authorities of the Third Reich declare war on the Soviet Union. And so begins Operation Barbarossa, which will claim the lives of millions of people. The Germans have one objective: to raze everything, and they won't stop until they achieve it. Let's see some images of the Nazis during the operation. Now let's imagine that at the same time Germany announces the beginning of hostilities, Stalin receives a second phone call, and again, they want to inform him of an urgent matter. To the surprise of the communist leader, his country is being invaded not only by the Nazis, but also by the Japanese. The Japanese army has reached the east coast of Russia and is advancing steadily. Stalin is surrounded on all sides, and if he doesn't react quickly, it will be his end. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you what would have happened if Japan had invaded the Soviet Union. Are you ready? Well then, get ready to travel through time. What we propose next is an exercise in alternate history. But before we begin, it's necessary to review how the relations between both countries were in the 20th century. Japan and the Soviet Union were on their way to becoming the dominant powers in Asia. Their main desire was to gain control of Manchuria, a region located in northeastern China. This competition escalated to the devastating Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. Tsar Nicholas II was convinced he could triumph, but the truth was that the Japanese troops were more disciplined and better equipped. The conflict lasted for a year and a half, and it ended with a crushing defeat for the Russians, who lost around 70,000 men. Next, we will see the recreation of a charge of Japanese soldiers. After achieving victory, Japan emerged as the most powerful nation on the continent. In the years following, with Russia transformed into the Soviet Union, the relationship between these countries was tense, although there was never another armed conflict. The Japanese government was extremely anti-communist, but Stalin was cautious and preferred not to tempt his luck by going to war. Now let's place ourselves in early 1941, in the midst of the Second World War, and imagine how a hypothetical invasion of the Soviet Union could have been. Emperor Hirohito, the Japanese ruler, desires to expand his domains and conquer all of Asia. He won't stop until his country enjoys the same prestige and power as England or the United States. His officers tell him he must choose between two different strategies. The first one involves swiftly attacking the European colonies in the Asian continent, establishing puppet regimes loyal to the empire, and seizing their natural resources. The second plan is to direct the troops towards distant Siberia, which is the easternmost part of the communist country. In our version of events, the emperor opts for this latter option. He believes that the Russian army is the same one that lost the war in 1905, so it's possible to crush it once again. His advisors implore him not to do it, telling him he's making a grave mistake, that Stalin will be a tough nut to crack, and that it's easier to conquer Southeast Asia. However, Hirohito turns a deaf ear and, following his instinct, communicates with Adolf Hitler to propose a pact. By this time, the German dictator is already planning Operation Barbarossa. After intense negotiations, the leaders reach a secret agreement. Germany will invade the Soviet Union from the west, and Japan will do so from the east. They are confident that the communists won't be able to deal with two open battlefronts simultaneously. In a matter of months, Stalin will raise the white flag and surrender. After the victory, the Third Reich and the Japanese Empire will divide up the Soviet territory, exterminate the population, and settle their own inhabitants there. The most important part of the pact establishes that they will divide the natural resources of the conquered country. For Japan, this is crucial, as it urgently needs oil for the operation of its armed forces. On June 22, 1941, the Wehrmacht begins its march towards the Soviet Union. On the same day, Japanese ships set sail for Siberia, while ground troops advance through China. For this operation, the Emperor has 800,000 men, 100 to 200 tanks, and 4,000 artillery pieces at his disposal. It's a formidable army, although far from surpassing the German one, which has nearly 4 million men, 3,400 tanks, 17,000 artillery pieces, and 750,000 horses. Nevertheless, Hirohito is confident that his strength will be sufficient to defeat Stalin. In the short term, the operation is a success for the Japanese, as Siberia is a harsh region with sparse population, and conquering it is not a difficult task. The communist government is more concerned about what is happening in the West, where the Germans advance, spreading death and destruction. Although Stalin is surprised by the actions of the Japanese Empire, he decides to concentrate his energies on stopping the Germans. He doesn't send troops to fight against the Japanese, who encounter no resistance and manage to capture Vladivostok, the most important city in Siberia. After seizing the city, Hirohito's soldiers commit a terrible massacre, killing hundreds of Russians. There are not enough reasons to explain the violent behavior of the troops. It was normal for them to behave this way, as recounted by this Chinese survivor of a massacre committed by the Japanese in real life.
抱着我这个挺小的弟弟，小弟弟拼命的哭，妈妈就给他起来，叫他不要哭。就在这个时候，那个日本鬼子扎了刺刀，一刺刀戳到我母亲就把我母亲倒下来了，倒下来小孩掉了要快掉的地下来了，母亲还趁着进去的，弟弟抱他，没给他掉下去。鬼子把这个刺刀拔出去以后，又一刺刀戳到我母亲脚还倒下来，把我弟弟摔在地下了，我弟弟丢在地下。
Returning to our narrative, the Japanese consider that they have the right to treat the inhabitants of Vladivostok as they please, without respecting international regulations that protect civilians from such mistreatment. Women, children, and the elderly are shot, and their bodies are left in the streets. When news of this bloodbath spreads throughout the country, indignation grips the Soviet population. People demand reprisals, and Stalin has no choice but to organize a military expedition to reconquer Siberia. The counteroffensive is effective, and the Japanese are expelled from Vladivostok. The emperor believed that the Soviet troops were weak, but he was mistaken. In the last decade, the Red Army modernized into a professional force, well-trained and equipped with technology superior to the Japanese. Hirohito's men are in retreat, while in the West, the Wehrmacht is facing serious problems. In our timeline, the Germans have the same difficulties they had in real life. On one hand, the Russian winter is relentless, destroying their supplies, damaging their weaponry and causing hypothermia deaths among their fighters. On the other hand, the Germans are too deep into Soviet territory, and it's difficult to maintain such extensive supply lines. They are far from Germany, and it can take months for provisions to reach their men. The logistical difficulties allow the Red Army to halt the German advance and gradually force them to retreat. Ultimately, the Japanese invasion has not tipped the balance in favor of the Axis, and Stalin manages to weather the storm and overcome his enemies. The situation of the Japanese Empire is desperate. It has the bulk of its troops anchored in Russia and has not conquered any significant territory, as Siberia is not an area abundant in raw materials. As his advisors warned him, Hirohito begins to think that he made a mistake in sending his men to the Soviet Union. Now, he is running out of fuel and has no way to power his tanks, planes, and ships. Within the Japanese army, there are those who dare to question the emperor, and some officers conspire to overthrow him through a coup d'etat. For now, let's leave the Asian continent and see what happens in North America. Remember that, in real life, the United States entered the war after Japan attacked its military base at Pearl Harbor. Let's see the moment when the American president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, declares war.
I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us.
In our version of events, the Japanese never attempt to conquer the Pacific Ocean, so the offensive on Pearl Harbor does not occur. Consequently, Uncle Sam has no excuses to enter the fight against the Axis. However, President Roosevelt seeks an excuse to plunge into the war. He knows that if they win the conflict in Europe, the fascists will come for his country. In early 1942, he asserts that German ships are illegally patrolling the North American coasts and demands that the authorities of the Third Reich withdraw their fleet from the waters of the Atlantic. Diplomatic tensions escalate until Hitler, who is determined not to yield in anything, declares war on the Americans. Italy and Japan do the same, so at this point, our hypothetical scenario is the same as what happened in reality. The difference is that the imperial troops are not in control of Southeast Asia and are stuck in Siberia. The North American and British fleets organize a joint operation to hunt down the Japanese warships prowling the Pacific. In the following months, the ocean becomes the great cemetery for imperial ships. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the Red Army undertakes a final advance on Hirohito's ground troops. The pressure is too much, and the Japanese have no choice but to retreat, losing all the territory they had conquered the previous year. Eventually, cornered, tired, and hungry, they have to return home. The discontent in Japan is enormous. Not only is the civilian population disappointed with the poor performance of his government, but the high command of the armed forces considers Hirohito to be a terrible strategist. Because of his incompetence, the glorious imperial army has been humiliated beyond endurance. The generals who were plotting a coup d'etat finally take action. Tanks surround the imperial palace, and a group of soldiers enters the residence, rifles in hand. The emperor is arrested on orders of the military authorities, who assume control of the government. A week later, he is subjected to an express trial for treason. In order not to shoot him, the coup plotters offer him the possibility of dying honorably and committing with a gun. Hirohito accepts and kills himself with a shot to the heart. Of course, this is far from what happened in real life, given that the president died of cancer in 1989, as you can see below.
Thousands of mourners gathered outside the Imperial Palace grounds throughout the day to sign books of condolence and to pay respects to the man who had been Japan's emperor for more than 62 years. Within hours of Hirohito's death, former Crown Prince Akihito presided over the first of many rituals marking his ascension to the throne.
Returning to our timeline, the priority of the new Japanese leaders is to negotiate peace with the Allies. Ideally, they want to sign an agreement that entails a favorable surrender, allowing Japan to maintain its international prestige. However, Stalin adamantly refuses this, as the Soviets have not forgotten the terrible massacre in Vladivostok. To quench their thirst for revenge, they want to see the empire devastated. Peace negotiations fail, and communist troops prepare to invade Japan. Meanwhile, the war in Europe follows the same course as in real life. Italy and Germany cannot withstand the Allies, and by 1945, they are defeated. Benito Mussolini is executed by the partisans, and Adolf Hitler shoots himself in the head. The only Axis nation still standing is the Japanese Empire, though it won't last long. Communist troops land on the island in mid-year and overcome the feeble defense attempts of the Japanese army. In less than a month, Stalin seizes control of almost the entire country. The Japanese government surrenders, and its generals are transferred to Moscow, where they are tried for the war crimes of Vladivostok. Naturally, they are found guilty and sentenced to death by firing squad. Like Germany, Japan is integrated into the Soviet Union, becoming a communist nation. World War II has officially come to an end, and in this version of events, atomic bombs were never dropped. In the decades to come, the Japanese people will have to adapt to living under the shadow of the Russians, who are the true rulers of their government. Eventually, as happened with other satellite countries of the Soviet Union, there will be rebellions and revolutions, but this is a topic for another episode. We've reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, what do you think would have happened if Japan had invaded the Soviet Union? Leave your answer in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.